Zionist books, and they're strange.
Camera in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Hi, welcome to Public Access. Today, my guest is Philip Farah. Philip's parents in the 1940s were forced to flee their homes in East Jerusalem because of what now is today Israel. We're going to be talking a lot about this subject, but mostly about what Philip has experienced in his personal life and how he has reflected upon this, but of course always on Public Access, how it affects you, the community. Thank you for joining me, Philip. I'm very excited to talk.
Thank you, Thomas.
I wanted to start the conversation a little close to home because we try to focus on local issues in a way here and how it affects people here in our city. You went to UNM. You graduated there in the 70s with your doctorate. And I wanted to kind of get your take on if you've been watching us protest here. You're going to UNM in the 70s. Did you ever think you'd get to a point where you saw students en masse getting the police out to UNM in order to protest for Palestine? You ever think you'd see something like that?
No, I didn't. When I was a student here, I was the head of the Arab Student Association for a while. We were very active. We invited speakers and had protests, actually. I remember we one time had a protest jointly with a Jewish group. I think it was New Jewish Agenda at the time, protesting some position that Jeff Bingaman took on Israel-Palestine. But you're right. I mean, I didn't expect that it would grow so big and so powerful. And unfortunately, the conditions in Palestine have brought this home. And now I do see. And Albuquerque has a long tradition of protest. I remember reading about the riots, so-called riots. When was it, 68?
Yeah, no, it was briefly in that time. I remember my father had seen some of that too, and it's...
I mean, they brought tanks out.
Right, no, the National Guard came out, and they were here to lock things down.
In fact,
we didn't get that bad, thankfully.
Say again?
We didn't get there to that point where we had tanks on our streets, but I mean, we had the SWAT team come out, and they came in.
I think there were tanks, actually, in Albuquerque.
Well, no, during the 60s, but not during the Palestine.
Right, yeah.
Well, I'm curious about that because I actually was at those protests and at UNM, and I saw the SWAT team, the police come and start to herd out protesters and start to put some force down on that. I'm curious, do you think that as protesters, we are moving in the right direction of how to address this issue in your homeland? Do you think we have the right idea going on here?
I think so. I mean, more needs to be done. The reason that people identify so much is because there are so many issues that really touch them, so many issues that the Palestinians are facing that touch their lives as well, or to which they can relate. For example, water issues. We were chatting about this earlier. And environmental, I mean, the environment in Gaza is being totally destroyed. Indigenous people's rights to the land. So it touches a lot of areas. And, Israel has had a role in repression all over the world, not just in the region. In Guatemala, when Rios Montt was the president or prime minister of Guatemala, the Carter administration at the time stopped sending arms to Guatemala, and Israel was supplying 100% of the arms to Guatemala. The relationship of Israel, the Zionists, to Central America preceded the existence of Israel. The United Fruit Company, the president of that company at the time, by the name of, I think, Zemurai, if my memory serves me right, was very close to Somoza the Elder, and illegal arms shipments to the Jewish forces in Palestine before it became a state in 48 were actually shipped on Nicaraguan flag ships. There, I mean, maybe people don't know these details, but they do know that, many people who are active on Central America, for example, on indigenous land rights, on environment, on arms control, all of these issues, see some aspect of that they in their lives that they can relate to with the Palestinians. And I think what's needed is that we create more coalitions and make it clearer that these relationships exist, so that we can grow our movement and make it more relevant to people's lives, like you said.
Well, that's an interesting way to approach it, because I think that's what I've struggled with as New Mexican a lot, is how do I contribute to this conversation in a way that is somehow productive. And that's what the protest group that has been organizing mainly focuses on, is divestment. This idea of, we want to divest our local economy from this war effort. I always struggled to know if it's an effective ask, if it's the right thing to be protesting for, but I know you have a lot of background in the divestment process against Israel.
Right.
And in fact, in the Huffington Post, you wrote about a very peculiar instance where, I think it was in Texas, they were withholding relief to families from hurricane aid because they needed to sign a pledge that said, "I'm not divesting from Israel."
That's right.
I've started to, in my own way, try to understand what is the right way to approach divesting from Israel. I'd love to know what your own experience with that has been, because you've been connected to that movement in a much greater way.
Right. So, I'll give you another very big example, which is Elbit Systems. Elbit is an Israeli military industrial company that has operations in so many places worldwide. By the way, they are the target of a lot of protests in England. I think they were forced to shut down some of their operations in England because of the protests. Elbit Systems is a big player in the apartheid wall, I call it, with Mexico. They were among the prime contractors on that project. So, the relationships are very strong. And I tell you, I mean, many jurisdictions in this country have passed ceasefire resolutions. We've had great difficulty in Fairfax County in Virginia passing a ceasefire resolution. It's because, it's not only the Jewish lobby, it's also the military-industrial lobby, because there are many companies that profit from the occupation, profit from the genocide, and they're getting, more and more profits now. They're reveling in the profits. They're the only people who really benefit from what's going on. And so, there are many companies, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, and many others, Raytheon, that have a presence in Fairfax County. And indirectly, they are the ones who get politicians elected, certainly help a great deal tipping the balance. And so it really is something that affects everybody. And I think that our movement needs to shine a light on that to grow further and stronger.
I like the way you say that about shining lights on relationships, trying to make sure that interaction is known. I mean, in our state, we're connected to the military bases here a lot. So from that, BlackRock uses a lot of our places for their company work. So the military-industrial complex is a huge part of our economy in our state. And I'm not very surprised when I find out that they are benefiting from war. That's their industry, and that's what they lobby for. I think what always strikes me more surprisingly, especially being on TV, there's a lot of Christian material that seems to be very pro-Israel. A lot of the Christian community in our country has been very much taken by the conflict and what I would say Israel's stances on that. I think you interest me so much because you're a founder of the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. You're a Palestinian Christian. You've come out of a place that, is as far as I've read, the birth of Christ, and that's kind of the idea. Is you're coming from a place into a country that's majority Christian now, yet so much of the Christian community seems to be on a different side of the argument. How do you think that comes to be, and how do you feel coming from that kind of
Right.
place?
Many Palestinian Christians talk about the fact that Jesus was basically a Jew who fought against empire, the Roman Empire. Was occupying the land that we know as Israel, Palestine now. And, the Romans did not crucify people randomly. They crucified people who really were seen as a threat to their interests. And Jesus' especially his overthrowing of the money changers' tables in the temple was a great confrontation to the Jewish establishment that were basically the proxies for the Romans. They were the quislings, frankly. And when he did that, that sealed his fate. Another point that's not very well known is that really Zionism started with Christians. There were Christian thinkers, especially in England, but elsewhere in Europe, who were really, frankly, anti-Semitic, some of them, in their perspective, who started the idea that the Jews ought to go back to Israel. Of course, there was no Israel at the time. It had been Palestine for centuries. In fact, it was Palestine at the time of the Romans. Excuse me. And so you had this dispensationalist ideology which preceded Herzl, preceded the birth of modern Jewish Zionism. And leaders like Herzl, thinkers like Herzl, learned a lot from these so-called Christian theologians. They had a very imperialist attitude of, we'll frankly solve the Jewish problem in Europe, basically get rid of the Jews, to put it very bluntly, and at the same time have a colonial outpost in the Middle East that will help the British Empire. And that's how Lord Shaftesbury at the time was one of the best known of these advocates of, it wasn't known as Zionism at the time, but he had a huge influence on Herzl and the others that later adopted Zionism, Zionist ideology. Now, you have this irony of Christians here. They call themselves Christians. I take issue with that. Who have these militarist positions. Who really openly defend the murder of Palestinians as a price that is necessary for the return of Christ. Recently, a bunch of us, actually a group called Christians for Free Palestine, a group that's growing very fast now, thankfully, and Jewish Voice for Peace cooperated in protesting the group called Christians United for Israel, KUFI, which is one of the largest pro-Israeli groups in this country, Christians, and right-wing militarists, tend to be racist Christians, basically white supremacists, thinly disguised, and they have their annual conference, usually in Washington, D.C. We protested. There was disruption of their opening event, And amazingly, Reverend Hagee, who is their leader of Kufi, he was giving a speech glorifying Israel, and in the background were the tanks rolling and destroying, this horrible image of destruction of Gaza, and he reveled in that. I mean, imagine what kind of Christianity revels in open destruction and open calls for, the murder of basically massacres in order to hasten the arrival of Christ. It's totally bizarre.
It's very strange.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem coherent to me. But that, I think that's war often. Whenever you can get to a point when you're advocating for the death of someone, that's a pretty extreme place to be in. You have to have a pretty extreme reason to believe someone should die. I think that's what makes your position to me so interesting. Is I first encountered you as you were giving a little speech, a conversation to a small audience, and you talked a lot about pacifism, how your pacifism played a great role into what you believed. This was not that long after October 7th either that you were giving this conversation, so at least closer than it was now. And I could understand that part of your tone was coming from a place that said, I don't think that, the violence that we're so caught up in the discussion is the right place to be. I mean, I actually asked you this that night too, which is, a lot of people who've come from your place, you grew up in Palestine, you've seen the way that your family and yourself has been treated, you've spent time behind bars with the IDF. You could easily be someone who doesn't believe in peace. You could very easily be someone who thinks pacifism is not the best way to get things done. How is it that you've managed to keep that place in your heart where you're saying, no, we have to figure out how to not, how is the Christian spirit approach this? Where does that come from?
Martin Luther King and many other leaders, nonviolence leaders, I prefer that nomination rather than pacifist.
I like that.
They have over and over again, people like Gandhi and even John F. Kennedy quoted, MLK actually quoted John F. Kennedy saying that if we don't give space to nonviolent protests, the alternative is not submission, is not, I don't remember the exact words, then you're going to get violence, and Gandhi said very, very similar things. Native American tribal leaders have said similar things. In all struggles, people do not pick up the gun randomly. People, though, who are oppressed are not going to submit to oppression. That really is not an option. So all emancipatory struggles start with, people going on strike, protesting in the streets, unions, organizing, and always the oppressor responds with very severe violence. And the more severe violence, the greater the chance is that, the other avenue, which is violence, comes into the fore. If you look historically at, protest movements, struggles for emancipation in India, in Algeria, in the colonies, the European colonies, you'll see examples where if the violence of the oppressor was extreme, not allowing any room for nonviolent resistance, then the struggle becomes, really violent, as in the case of Algeria. The French were so incredibly brutal towards the movement that started out nonviolently of the Algerian people, that, they shut down all avenues of peaceful resistance. In India, the story of emancipation of India was not the story of Gandhi also. There were violent uprisings, in India. Fortunately, because to a large extent of international support and international pressure, even in England itself, uh, the the path that Gandhi chose was successful, you know, to a large extent. It was not 100% success. South Africa, the same thing, you know. Um, so, I believe that, for the good of everybody, um, nonviolent resistance is really the best path uh, because, you can approach the brink of disaster when there's repression that leads to violence.
Well, I like the way you describe that, where you can oppress a people to an extent where non-violent resistance is impossible or just extremely hard to find amongst the people there. Um, I mean, I have to wonder. I mean, the part of the reason I even started talking on TV is because after that conflict, I wanted to learn more, and I spoke to our Holocaust Museum here on TV, and I try. That interview was really me just trying to figure out how do I even approach the subject. I've never seen something like this in my life. I knew a little bit about the Palestinian conflict before that, before October 7th, but I never really had to grapple with something that extreme before, and then especially the months following, having to find more people to talk to try to expand my scope of how to feel about things like that. And, we've had a long time since October 7th, but I'm really curious in what it's been like.
Excuse me.
What was your no, of course, you're getting over a cough, so no, that's completely okay. I really like to know what your kind of reaction was on October 7th, and I mean it in the heartbreak that has to come after, because every single day after October 7th has been brutal against the Palestinians. I mean, I think we're now at around 60,000 Palestinians that we're saying are dead, or is it 40,000?
41,000 now.
41,000 is the number that's mostly being put around, and it's just heartbreaking. It's hard to fathom, and it all comes in a place of justification because there was one other day of such horrific violence that they feel a need to do this. What was your reaction on October 7th, and how has that opinion played out as this conflict has carried out?
It's really what happened on October 7th is a confluence of a lot that preceded it. It certainly did not happen in a vacuum, and I'm sure you've heard that.
Oh, certainly.
You know, let me just go a little bit farther back. In, I think, May of 23, or no, May of 22, the U.S. administration delisted from the list of terrorist organization an Israeli group, a Jewish Israeli group called I'm sorry, Kahana Hai. Kahana was a rabbi who was an ultra-fascist, and he started a group that openly talked about, ethnically cleansing the Palestinians, and participated in really terrorist attacks on Palestinians.
But they
And
declassified him as a terrorist.
Okay, and so the U.S. had to put him on, had to put this organization, Kach, it was called. Kach means strength, I think, in Hebrew, and or power. And they put him on, they put the organization on the terrorist list. And actually, Kahana himself, if I'm not mistaken, spent some time in an Israeli prison, and some of his followers did, including a man by the name of Ben Gvir. And now Ben Gvir is the Minister of Security Affairs in Israel. So again, in May of 2022, the U.S. Department of State delisted Kahana Hai from the list of terrorism. That was a signal to the Likud, which
Likud
is
party, which is in power right now.
in power in Israel, the leading party in the Knesset, led by Netanyahu, to form a coalition which included Ben Gvir.
Who's now said some pretty racist things
Right.
his entire
Right.
administration.
And folks like Bezalel Smotrich, who's just as bad. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, truly, truly fascist people. In fact, Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance in Israel, prides himself on being a fascist homophobe, his words. So, you know, so that government was formed, and Israel started increasing tremendously the level of violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, in the West Bank, and you know, and the extreme religious Zionists started provoking incidents in the Dome of the Rock, the Aqsa Mosque, the holiest, one of the holiest places for Muslims, you know. So the pressure was increasing tremendously, and there were pogroms, if you remember, at the time. Jewish settlers, with the protection of the Israeli army and sometimes even active support of the Israeli army, were burning homes in villages. The best known case was Hawara, a village near Nablus. So it really was becoming a powder keg. We'd always had, you know, and mass arrests and torture, and, you know, was increasing. It was always there, and confiscation of land and building more and more settlements. You know, the pressure was building. And especially for Hamas, which is a Muslim organization, you know, the desecration of the Aqsa Mosque by Jewish settlers was really, you know, an extremely provocative. They felt they had to respond. Meanwhile, you know, Israel had withdrawn a lot of its units from the south because they thought that Hamas is not going to do anything. You know, they're too weak to do anything, and placed them in the West Bank to protect these mad, raving mad settlers who were wreaking havoc in the West Bank. And then Hamas, you know,
Took advantage.
took advantage. And you know, I really don't know. I'm sure there were instances of abuse that Hamas fighters committed. But another big issue was that when they opened the border, they how do you call it? You know, they opened a lot of the border of Gaza with Israel. All kinds of people started streaming in. Now, these were people who were refugees in refugee camps, and their villages had been on the other side of the border, and now are Israeli, you know, towns and villages. And many of these people had lost, you know, relatives, family members in previous Israeli massacres, especially 2009, 2014, but there were many others, 2021, you know. So these were people who were undisciplined, and they poured into the Israeli border and did very ugly things. There's definitely no doubt that Palestinians committed ugly things on October 7th. But also, Israel has something called the Hannibal Doctrine.
The Hannibal Doctrine.
The Hannibal Doctrine is a doctrine that says we should not allow Jewish hostages to be taken by Hamas. We should do everything possible to kill the attackers, the Palestinian attackers, even if that means, you know, killing a lot of Israelis. And it is very well documented, including by Jewish media sources like Haaretz and others, that many Jewish Israelis in the south on October 7th were actually killed by Israeli fire. I'm not, excusing
Sure.
the ugly things that the Palestinians did. Now, I tell you, as a Palestinian, for me to see the Palestinians from Gaza streaming across the border, there was part of me that says, oh my God, these are people, going back to see what they learned from their parents and grandparents, our villages, their parents and grandparents who were refugees. And, so that's one thing that went through my mind. It didn't go through my mind that, what was probably not surprising, that they also committed some ugly things. But, so nothing happened in a vacuum. There had been horrible conditions of Palestinians in the West Bank that Hamas felt in order to preserve its prestige, they had to respond.
Well, I think you put together this narrative really well, which, describes a really, you describe pressure like a powder keg, where you're
Right.
just continually amplifying these things, where you have settlers coming out, taking land, burning olive trees, forcing out locals. They're the kind of groups that organize in order to harass locals and to harass Palestinians. They're starting to be regulated a lot less, and now you have people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir going into power with Netanyahu, who has long spoken that he doesn't believe Palestinians have self-determination.
Right.
You kind of put now all of those right pieces together, and because of it, they have to draw so much military out to the settlements in order to keep things controlled there, because
Right.
things are just getting out of control.
Well, really to protect the settlers,
To protect-
more than anything else.
In fact, if I'm correct, there was even politicians who were going out to the settlements to
Oh,
try
yes.
to do publicity and try to make sure that there was
And arm the settlers.
and trying arm settlers as well. And in fact, those are some of the organizations that used to be deemed terrorists that no longer are. And for some reason, all of that just put up the right scenario for a day of mass violence to be able to occur. And from that on, we've been dealing with the consequences of now the most violent intentions of certainly the Israeli government, of what they've put forward. What would you...
If I may,
Sure.
also one has to keep in mind that a lot of these stories that Israel put forth about October 7th were pure fabrication.
There was a lot of fabrication.
And
Not that
and
there wasn't
again,
bad, but there was a lot of fabrication.
yeah,
It was
the-
mixed in with everything.
Yeah, I mean, the story of babies being hung on clotheslines
That one was
and
huge.
babies' heads being chopped.
Those are
and,
huge stories, yeah.
These were
That all turned out to be false.
Absolutely
Not a single
turned
one of
out
them
to
were
be
true.
false. Even the BBC, exposed some of these falsehoods, and many other outlets have clearly documented the fact that many of the people who were killed by Israeli fire,
Right.
including, by the way, a military official, an Israeli military official, admitted that some killings were done,
And that's the Hannibal
according
Directive
to
you
the
talked about there, yeah.
Hannibal Directive, exactly.
But I have to imagine watching the violence occur, as someone who is a non-violent speaker, there had to be a moment where you realized that this could not end well, that this happened.
Oh, yes, yes.
That they're like,
Absolutely.
Whatever has happened, it's hard to tell, because Israel is clearly taking the route of, we're going to amplify whatever violence has happened, and plenty of it has happened. We don't even need to tell the truth that 800 Israeli citizens have been killed. We're going to amplify these numbers as much. We're going to make these stories, and that's been continuing since. There's been Israeli hostages that have been rescued that they've had to correct their statements, saying, oh, this Israeli hostage was beaten by her captors, and in reality it turned out she was in a building that collapsed, and she had to come out of her own kind of seclusiveness of being a freed hostage to correct her own government. I mean, you had to see very quickly that this was going to take a turn for the worst as a non-violent speaker.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. again, not to excuse the, the crimes that were committed. And, I mean, look, Nat Turner rebellion in the U.S. by former slaves, there were whites who were massacred. The indigenous fighters for land rights in the U.S. Also, committed massacres against civilians. In every struggle, it is actually, in a way, I see it as racist to expect that those who are oppressed are going to be, pure angels.
Sure.
And when they are themselves the victims of extreme violence, to expect, to hold the oppressed to a higher standard
Yeah.
when, the boot is on your neck, and not only the boot on your neck, but your children have been killed and burned by napalm bombs and by all kinds of
You don't make peaceful people
violence.
that way, do you?
Right. So not to excuse any of that,
No.
but here is a really crucial point, that every time Hamas ideology is not one that I subscribe to, but there were many junctures in the history of Hamas where Hamas was calling for a long-term truce, and even at one point they accepted the two-state solution. Actually, today, the official position of Hamas is that if Israel accepts a two-state solution where it withdraws from all the 1967 territories, there will be peace. But Hamas started at a time when Israel considered the PLO as its prime enemy. And actually, Israel allowed Hamas to operate with very, very little, controls. They practically did whatever they wanted, because at the time the leader of Hamas declared that there ought to be a 20-year truce with Israel, because their ideology said the liberation of Palestine is going to come not directly, but after the liberation of the whole Ummah, the whole Muslim Ummah. That was their ideology, is that we can't deal with Palestine now. We have to free the Muslim nation itself, to revive it, and then comes Palestine 20 years later. And so they said, okay, we'll let Hamas do what they want. And this happened in many other, so they allowed Hamas to operate because for them the enemy was the PLO. It was a divide and rule policy. And in many cases where Hamas leaders made very moderate suggestions for a truce, for a long-term truce, for a two-state solution, etc., Israel would create events, provocations to that were guaranteed to get a reaction from Hamas, a violent reaction. So Israel would say, look, we can't deal with these people. In fact, Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders have said, that they consider Hamas an asset, because unlike the PLO wants a settlement for a two-state solution, and the Israeli leaders can point to Hamas and say, look, they don't want peace, so we can't deal with the Palestinians. They've made statements, outright, that they consider Hamas an asset.
And well, they gave him a lot of money to start with, so.
Yeah, they gave him money, exactly. There was actually a fund early on for Hamas in the Israeli government.
So here's then, I guess, what I'd be very interested in knowing from you, which is, we're at a point where, and Netanyahu is not encouraged to end this war anytime soon. He goes to a criminal trial for corruption as soon as it's over. You were at a place where the Houthis in Yemen are continually attacking trade routes and the sea. where in Lebanon we have Hezbollah, which is the 8th largest missile collection in the world, that are pretty determined to use that now against Israel, and Israel seems pretty excited to invade Lebanon. They want to draw us into more regional conflict. As a nonviolent speaker, do you feel like you're watching, the conflict in your homeland? Do you feel like nonviolence is becoming harder, that it's becoming less likely the way things will end, or are you still pretty committed that the peace will come through nonviolence, that is the best way to come?
I think a great deal depends on the international solidarity movement. Now, that was, like I said earlier, very important for the struggle for emancipation in India, liberation, independence from the British. The international solidarity with Indian people was very, very important. Same with South Africa. The BDS movement for South African, against South African apartheid played a huge role in preventing a much more violent outcome in South Africa. In the case of Palestine, it's even more important because the Palestinians are much smaller in population than India, are up against a much, much more powerful enemy. And I really believe that, the BDS movement worldwide is so important. And like I said, there's so many connections that tie us to the struggles of other people. And I do see that the BDS movement is getting stronger. And for that, I place a great deal of hope on this. I mean, the only people who are benefiting from the genocide are the military-industrial complex companies. One has to be totally out of their mind to believe that what Israel is doing is going to bring peace to anybody in this, including Israeli Jews. And the U.S. has played an extremely important role in giving Israeli Jews an illusion that what their military is doing is legitimate. No matter what Israel does, the arms shipments continue. The 2,000-pound bombs that are, destroying whole blocks of cities. By the way, let me also talk about the number of 41,000. That's a huge underestimate of the victims that Israel has massacred. So the arms keep flowing. Netanyahu is invited to the United States, given red carpet treatment with congressmen and senators applauding every few seconds of his speech.
And our senators gave a standing applause to him when he came here.
Yes. So he goes back to Israel and says, look, no matter what, small voices come out of the U.S. administration, they really don't mean it, and they are supporting me all the way, So in a way, I really see even Israeli Jews as a victim, a victim, and I see us, not us, but the U.S. administration as being complicit in, creating this illusion that what Israel is doing is for the safety of Israeli Jews and for the stability of the region. It's insane, and so you create this mass hysteria, and you're really also standing with the most fascist elements in Israel, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, outright fascists, and against the interests of the hundreds of thousands of Israelis even who are protesting in the streets. Netanyahu can go back and say, look, America is with me, so I'm the key to your safety and your future, and thereby, undermining even in Israel, those who are calling for a ceasefire and for more democracy in Israel itself. Israel, is really, I mean, in a way, it's kind of tearing away at the viability of Israeli society. And the U.S. is largely to blame, I think.
Well,
And that is because of the military-industrial
Right,
complex.
well,
The dinero keeps flowing, and their profits are going through the roof.
and I try to explain some of this to people that I know that like to vote, I would say, along party lines, and it's heartbreaking for me because as a third party voter, I'm voting against a very massive regime that I have very little ability to make an effect on. And what we have are two people who are, one of them is going to have power by November in our country, and both of them have committed to continue giving these massive 2,000 pound bombs that are just too big to be accurate, that are going to be guaranteed to kill more innocent people in Palestine. I know that my senators and and whoever my president's going to be is organizing and moving these bombs to kill people.
Yeah.
It's a very hard thing to look at as a citizen who doesn't want my money to be doing that, but I feel very powerless to make it happen. I mean, I don't know if I even have a question even coming out of that. You talk very well about the military-industrial complex, about how that seems to be the motivating factor for all of our resources to keep flowing towards that country.
If I may,
Yeah.
may I go back to the question of the number of people killed in
Sure,
in
that's a
Gaza?
great place to go back to.
So, the number is now 41,000, and these are numbers that come from the health authorities in Gaza. And even American officials have said that they may be an undercount. According to the British Lancet magazine, which is a journal, very prestigious medical journal, the number of people who are confirmed to have been killed by bombs and missiles and snipers is only the tip of the iceberg. Then there's the people who are under the rubble still and who have died, and they're not counted. But in addition to that, I'll give you an example from my own relatives in Gaza. The Christian Palestinian Arab community in Gaza is a small minority. Almost all of them are taking refuge in two churches. The Church of St. Porphyrius, which is the church where my grandparents were baptized, my father, uncles, and aunt, and the Church of the Holy Family, which is Catholic, St. Porphyrius, Orthodox, Greek Orthodox. And these are now the shelters for the almost over 90% of the remaining Christians, who are a tiny minority now, only in the hundreds. And so my relative, a woman by the name of Philip Farah, 84-year-old woman, she survived the bombing of the St. Porphyrius church, which killed 18 Christians sheltering in that church. Israel bombed that church. 18 people died, including 4 relatives of mine. Ilham Farah, my relative, survived that bombing. She moved to the Church of the Holy Family, and after a couple of months, she was exasperated. She wanted a change of clothes. She tried to go home. She was shot by an Israeli sniper. When a sniper shoots at you, they know exactly who they're shooting, an 84-year-old woman. She bled for hours. She was on the phone trying to get help, but anybody who tried to get her was shot at. So she bled to death. But that's not the end of the story. There are people, relatives of mine, who, because they don't have access to medicine, they don't have access to food, good food, and they're really starving, some of them. And they don't have access to clean water, have been dying, especially the elderly, and some children also. And one of my relatives died actually out of starvation, an elderly woman by the name of Philip Farah. So when the Lancet says the number is 186,000 at least, you can imagine, how the real numbers stand. And Ralph Nader has recently looked into this, and he's looking into the future. And there's the diseases, now there's polio, I mean, Israel has completely destroyed the health infrastructure, has destroyed the infrastructure, no water, no clean water, no electricity, and so you're going to have mass disease killings. And he estimated, Ralph Nader and his experts estimated that 500,000 people will have died by the end of this year. 500,000 people out of 2.3 million. I mean, if this is not genocide, what is? And our government keeps supplying the bombs.
And which rounds that point out pretty well, I think. I mean, you tell me stories of your family who, an 80-year-old woman who wants just to leave her home to get a change of clothes. I mean, that's all she wants. I mean, beyond all the things of needing food, water, the need to leave a church that you're sheltering in. And for a sniper to have the will to kill that woman for that crime, for wanting to go change her clothes and leave her shelter. It's an insane thing to me, and I don't know how to wrap my head around it. You grew up in East Jerusalem in still a pretty bad environment. What was it like for you being there and seeing that from your people? Was it different as a Christian there, or did you kind of have the same treatment and feeling, did the checkpoint still make you feel as ostracized from everyone else as it does there? I mean, what was your experience like there?
Yeah, so Palestinians are now tiny minority. We used to be about 14% of the population, but because Christians have had more avenues, because of the relationship with the West, more avenues to immigrate, and also, of course, because of Jewish immigration. Now we are only about 2%, from about 14% in the 1920s, and then there was the mass immigration especially after the Holocaust. People rightfully, seeking shelter. And coming to Palestine. Anyway, that's another story altogether. But the Palestinian Christians are a tiny minority now, but we face exactly the same oppression as our Muslim neighbors. There has been very, very little, problems as a minority in a Muslim majority country. Under Muslim rule, I'm not saying that it was perfect throughout history, but far more tolerant than Europe historically was towards Jews,
Fair, yeah.
certainly, towards minorities, So we face exactly the same issues. I mean, really terror, a reign of terror, occupation where you have absolutely no freedom of expression, where your land can be confiscated at any time. Some of our land was confiscated, although we didn't own much, but the little we owned, some of it was confiscated to build illegal settlements. I was in prison under what's called administrative detention for 2 months. I was very lucky.
So why, can I ask why that was, by the way?
Under administrative detention, you have no right to know what the charges against you are.
Really?
It was inherited from the British, who used it in Ireland and in Malaysia and all
So
the
they didn't
positions.
tell you why? I mean, did you
Absolutely
kind of have an
not.
idea, or?
They just tell your lawyer. Your lawyer appears before a military tribunal. You're not allowed to appear before the tribunal.
But they do. Okay.
Your lawyer is told that you're a threat to the security of the state. Not much more detail than that.
That's.
And the real reason, I think, was because a group of us, kind of mostly intellectuals, from universities in the West Bank at the time. I'm talking 1976, long time ago.
When you were a professor at.
I taught for 1 year at Birzeit University. but before that, I was a high school teacher, and so some of us were meeting with Israeli leftists who were against the occupation, and I think that was the real reason for it. But you know, I mean, that
That-
was the threat to the security,
That's all it
because
took.
we had a dialogue group with with Israelis.
But that's all it took for you to not feel safe in your own homeland.
Oh, absolutely
Is
not.
going is you're arrested, you're not treated well while you're.
Oh, I was beaten up very badly.
You-
I was tortured. I mean, that's standard. But now, oh my God, now it is far, far worse. You know, I don't know if you've come across the recent reports about torture in Israel.
absolutely.
It's now on an industrial scale and far, far more severe. You know, like with basically rape and electric shocks and handcuffing and you know forcing people to be in very uncomfortable positions that cut their circulation. Many people have died simply from the handcuffing.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I mean, it wasn't as bad back then. It was horrible,
I
but
mean, it sounds
now
pretty.
it is on steroids.
Well, it sounds.
With Ben Gvir being in. You know,
I can imagine. I mean,
Yeah.
now on TV in Israel, they debate those kind of things and whether or not torture and rape are acceptable on TV. That those are just their TV conversations debating whether or not those are acceptable behaviors.
And many
And-
Israeli politicians say absolutely they're
Oh, absolutely. I know Ben Gvir
legitimate.
thinks that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, but yet what you've described to me, what you've experienced, going to prison, not being told what your charges are, being treated to that brutal extent while you're in custody, and then all for really using your voice and intellect because you are a professor in the West Bank to try to start understanding how you organize for your community, for your land, for a place that you call home. I mean, what is that kind of final thought that you leave with when you look at your homeland, you see it torn up by just vicious violence, but yet you, as someone who is not violent, yet was arrested by these people, how do you see this playing out in the future? Where do you want to see your home?
Again, I go back to the importance of the role of solidarity, international solidarity, like especially the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, sanctions. And not only is it going to give us hope, you know, that there is a path other than violence, but it will also, I think, embolden Israeli Jews who are beginning to see. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, you've heard about the hundreds of thousands who have been protesting, calling for for Prime Minister Netanyahu to resign, and calling for a ceasefire. And really, you know, people who are concerned about the viability of their country. So I think, you know, as an antidote to those who invite Netanyahu to Congress and give him a red carpet treatment and standing ovations every few seconds of his speech, they are also seeing, you know, Americans in the tens of thousands protesting, and you know, even mainstream Americans in the churches, and you know, not wild-eyed radical students who are telling Israel, no, you know, we won't stand with you. This is what you're doing is crazy. So it'll embolden, I think, you know, it's an antidote to the powers in the U.S., the military-industrial complex that's reveling with the genocide, and now, you know, I hope that if it will even open the eyes of many Israelis even more to and make them take even more stronger positions against the madness that their country is. You know, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I really put a lot of hope that the solidarity movement with the people of Palestine uh, is really very much and very crucial part of the solution.
Well, I think you say it best, which is the best role Albuquerque can hopefully play is to continue to protest and continue to be vocal. I have one last question before we're done here, and I have this question because I recently saw that there's tons of different organizations that have been organizing protests for Palestine in Albuquerque. We've discussed some of them so far. One of them has organized a protest on October 5th, and the language promoting this protest that they've planned out is part of it saying that it's been 1 year and an anniversary since Palestine showed it will continue to resist. And just in my immediate reaction, I felt like there was something strange about saying that we're going to put this event together as an annual rememberation of October 7th because I the reason I started to even get into this kind of talking with people is because I wanted to understand events like that more. And I found it very strange and maybe different to what my own beliefs to gather and almost commemorate something like that because really it's been tragic that day and every day since. And I feel like sometimes when you have the phrases that and protests that I have helped chant, which are by any means necessary, things like that, which certainly I would say as someone who would like nonviolence to be always the best way possible. I know nonviolence isn't always the best only way to resist. And I'm never sure if there's a right way to protest or a wrong way to protest. And sometimes protests like this really make me question that line of, am I supporting violence for the sake of violence, or am I supporting people who are being massacred, obliterated by an evil regime that wants them dead? Is there a right way to protest? Is there a wrong way to protest?
As somebody who is a founder of Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace and who strongly believes in nonviolence as the sane way for emancipation, I see that the protest movement sometimes does make mistakes, and we need to speak out. And the key is to widen the circle of protests and bring people in, who will abhor, violence. And the more we do that, the more we're able to grow the movement and make it stronger. So yeah, I mean, speak out and say, I won't repeat the chant by any means necessary.
That's not a chant you like. Well, I understand that feeling. I don't write the chants when I go to a protest. I see a massacre. I see genocide. And I feel moved to say my leaders enabled this genocide and I need it to stop. And that's why on this channel I try to cover as much as possible the reaction that people here in Albuquerque are having to this genocide. And I'm glad that you were able to come find a home in Albuquerque at one point in your life and attend UNM. And I'm glad that UNM can continue that process of supporting the Palestinian movement. Do you have anything you'd like to say before we go to the UNM protesters?
I'm really greatly humbled by the support that I'm seeing. When I spoke at the Peace Center, I don't remember, April was it? People came up to me and said things that, I didn't know. For example, one of the largest suppliers of gasoline in the south of the state, I think, is an Israeli company called, I think they're called Alone. They sell gas.
Major southern gas
And
company,
it's an Israeli company, and there are people who are, thinking of starting a campaign to boycott that company. So, there are all kinds of ways that people can find local issues to connect with the movement, and I hope that will grow.
Well, I think it helps a lot when folks like you come here to Albuquerque and you help communicate what you've seen in your vision. So thank you so much, Philip. I appreciate the time today.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. We're good.